Welcome back from the break, Matrix. If you have just joined us, we are doing your exam guide to help you prep for your upcoming exam. If you've ever run out of data while online searching for some educational content, then this next competition is exactly for you. Wizard Matrix is bringing you #WazzoWinner competition, where 2 Matrix stand a chance to win 2 gigs of data. All you need to do is head on over to our Facebook page to see all of the details and enter the competition. Let's not waste any more time. Let's head straight back to Mamsi.
Thank you, Luni. Welcome back, guys. I hope you enjoyed the first segment where I gave you tips on how to choose the different questions in your history exam. So we're going to carry on. I'm going to give you more tips on how to answer questions in your exam. Okay. So now we're starting with answering a source-based question. Remember, before the break I told you that it is important to read and follow instructions. If you do that, you will never go wrong. Okay, and then the understanding of content is also very, very important. So remember I told you guys about time management as well, that during your reading time, what will help you is reading all those long sources that are contained in your source booklet. Make sure you understand the meanings of different words. Okay, in most cases, there is a glossary of terms, difficult terms that will be given, but there will be some concepts that a history student is expected to know. So you need to spend the time reminding yourself of what those different words mean. That is very important. And then another thing is you have to use your own words when answering questions. That goes back to the point about reading instructions. So if you're reading a source and they ask you to give a definition of a historical concept, what will happen is that the definition will not be contained in the source. Or if it is contained in the source, it will be contained in a different way. You have to use your own words to show that you understand the meaning of that concept. Please don't just repeat the words of the source unless the instruction tells you to do that. If the instruction says, quote from the source, that means you are just writing the words as they are. However, when you are expected to interpret, then you have to use your own words. That is very important. Okay. Now, you have to know the meaning of instructions like compare, analyze, and evaluate. Okay, there are more instruction words that are likely to be used in an exam. I'm just giving you some examples here. I'm not saying that every question you will get will require you to compare, analyze, or evaluate. However, these are the skills that you are likely to find in a history exam because we know historians like doing those things. So, for instance, if you look at the first one, when you're asked to compare, obviously they are asking you to give similarities. So don't go and look for differences when you are asked to compare. Okay, if they are asking for differences, they're going to say to you, contrast. Compare and contrast, then you are giving both similarities and differences. And then the next one, when you analyze, that means you now look at the source, you interpret it, okay, you break it down to come up with your own informed conclusions based on that source. Again, it goes back to a point I made earlier about not rewriting the source. You are not quoting directly, but you're analyzing. So in history, when you're analyzing, that means you are providing meaning to things. So if you have, let's say, a speech or a visual source, then you are giving meaning to it. And you are saying, this is what the writer, the author of this source was trying to say. Okay. And then when you're evaluating, now that is the one skill that most historians struggle with. When you're evaluating, and the question will tell you that you need to look at things like the origin of the source. Who wrote the source? When was the source written? Those are very important. What was the purpose of writing the source? And then you cannot leave out the value and limitations of the source. Now, the value of the source refers to the good things about the source. So what are the good things that we can get from reading this source? And then the limitations of the source, as the word suggests, will be the shortfalls of the source, the limitations. Like you'll be looking at things like the source is biased or one-sided. therefore it cannot be trusted. Or this source was written long after the event, there was the likelihood of memory loss and all those things. Okay, but we will obviously come back to these skills when we look at the actual examples. So now, guys, remember I told you when you're evaluating, the main things to look for are the origin of the source, the purpose or intention, the value, and limitation. If you don't look at all those 4 things, you are not going to get full marks. That is very, very important. Make sure you know and understand what is meant by all those things. And different sources obviously will have different limitations and different values. But one thing I need to tell you before we move on to more tips is that when you look at sources in history, they all contain value and limitation. You must never ever say this source is only valuable and it has no limitations. That is not true. All sources contain value and limitation, and all that depends on what the source is being used for. Okay, so don't forget that, guys. Now let's move on. And then another thing is you have to recognize the different types of sources. So if you look at the past papers, because that is another thing you have to do, guys, is you have to work through the past papers just to see how the questions get asked. Obviously, they will not repeat the exact same questions as, say, last year's exam. However, you will get an idea of what type of questions to expect. So it's very important that you know that there are textual sources and there are also visual sources. And there are different things you need to look for in those sources when you are analyzing and evaluating them. That is very important. Also, it's very important to note that there is a difference between a photo and a cartoon. So when you're answering questions, you have to be mindful of the type of source you are dealing with. Okay, and then the next thing is you have to read those sources carefully. As I said before, that you have to understand them. Comprehension is very important because you will not be able to analyze and evaluate if you cannot even understand what the source is saying. Okay, and that understanding, again, as I said before, will be based on your prior knowledge as well. So studying is also very important so that you can read that source in context of what you already know about the event. And then you have to highlight the key phrases or key words. That is very important when you are reading a source. And what I would do if I was writing an exam is to read the sources first before I read the questions and try to put myself in the shoes of a teacher and say, what type of questions would I ask from this source? What are the important things? So you'd have to look at things like the key figures, that is the people. So look at the names of the people, highlight or underline them. You look at the dates, okay? You look at the events. And then another very important thing in history is cause and effect. So in the source, they can tell you that this is what happened and it led to this. So those things are likely to be asked in the questions. So that is what you need to do. Underline and highlight all those important things. Places as well are very important. So I said it's people, it's the dates, and places where events took place. Okay, and then you have to identify the origin of the source. Now, the origin of the source normally comes from the caption. So the caption before you even read the source will help you when it comes to evaluating the source, because that caption will tell you what the source is, when it was made, and who made it. So it's very important that you don't just go straight to the source, but you start reading the caption. The captions are there for a reason, okay? And they will help you to answer those questions. Very, very important, guys. So let's look at the example of a text-based source. I'm not going to read the entire source here, guys, but I'm just going to highlight what is important. As I said to you, it's very important to read the caption. Now, let's read this caption together. It says, the source below outlines why Cuba became the focal point of the Cold War. So now, if you look at this, it says why. this is very important. So you already know, even before reading the source, that it's going to give you reasons why Cuba became the focal point of the Cold War between the United States of America and the Soviet Union, and it tells you that it's in the 1960s. So already you have a lot of information that you can use in the answer just from reading the caption before you read the actual source. Okay, so now let's move on to the actual source. As I said to you, we are not going to read the entire source, but I'm just going to show you some of the things that you will have to highlight. So you can see here they've included Batista, very important. You have Fidel Castro, very important. You have the date here, the 1st of January 1959. All those things are important. And then it also tells you here that the U.S. president, I'm going to start here where it says U.S. president was Dwight Eisenhower. You already know that. The vice president, Richard Nixon. All those are important things that you would have to highlight because, as I said to you, you will be expected to use them when you're answering your question. Okay, and you need to bear in mind when you're highlighting and underlining, bear in mind what the source is about. Remember when we were looking at the caption, we said it is looking at why Cuba was the focal point. So when you're reading the source, you need to be looking for all those reasons why Cuba was the focal point of the Cold War. Okay, now this is the next part of the source. It tells you that in 1961, J.F. Kennedy, so that's another one that we need to underline, became the President of the United States. So this is now going to be another key figure that you will have to remember. Okay, then another date here is April 1961. Don't worry about the figures, even though they can be asked. They're very, very easy to spot when you go back to the source. And then the Bay of Pigs. That is also very important in the context because you don't know if there's going to be a question asking you about the Bay of Pigs invasion. What happened there? And that will help you understand why the United States and the USSR were fighting over Cuba. What was the importance of the Bay of Pigs incident? Those things are very, very important. Okay, let's move on to the rest of the source. Okay, so there is another figure that we introduced to here, that is Nikita Khrushchev. So again, it tells you what you did here, that Castro turned to Nikita Khrushchev for protection against future U.S. aggression. So obviously you can see that he was from the USSR because the caption did tell you that Cuba was the focal point of the Cold War between these two superpowers, the United States and the USSR. Okay, I hope you understand, guys. At the end of this source, it tells you where it came from. Okay, so this is the book titled The Cold War by D. Murphy. Now, when you're evaluating the source, you do not need to worry about this information. The information that is going to help you to give you the origin, purpose, value, and limitation will be found in the actual caption. So don't worry about this. This is normally put there to protect the examiner to show that they have not plagiarized. That is where they got the information from. So what is important for you guys is to read that caption as I said before. Okay, I hope you've understood everything. Okay, guys, so now I'm going to show you an example of a question that you're likely to get in the exam. Now, remember I told you earlier that it's very important for you to know the concepts and also to use your own words and also to use your time wisely. So during your reading time, when you're reading the sources, it's also important to read the questions. Because remember I told you that you cannot just read the source once and understand it. So once you've read the sources and then read the questions, you can then go back to read the source again. And this time around, you'll be reading the source with the questions in mind. So when you're reading it, you will be looking for the answers to your questions. Okay, I hope that makes sense. So if we look at this one example here, it says define the concept of democracy in your own words. It does even tell you that this should be in your own words. Again, guys, you cannot just rephrase or paraphrase the source. You have to use your own words. As I said before, that is where studying comes in. So you should walk into the exam knowing all these different historical concepts already. Okay, so let's look at the key ideas in the answer. It's a government for the people, by the people, freedom of the citizens in a country to elect a leader of their choice, a political system that allows for freedom of speech, association, and the press, and any other relevant response. So what they do is they accept any other response as long as it is relevant. It doesn't mean that you have to use the words of the memo exactly as they are. Okay, we call these the marking guidelines. It's just a guide. So if you can use your own words to define those terms, then you will be fine. Okay, let's look at the next question. It says, comment on what you think the words ultimatum to Khrushchev, move those missiles, convey in the context of the in the context of the crisis in Cuba. So again, guys, remember I told you that it's not only comprehension that we are looking for in the source. We are looking at whether you can analyze the source in order to be able to draw your own conclusions. So you need to give your own comment based on what is said in the source. So if we look at some key ideas in your answer here, it's that the Cuban Missile Crisis could only be resolved if the Soviet missiles were removed from Cuba. The ultimatum suggests that the USA, Kennedy, wielded more power than the Soviet Union. Kennedy ordered or warned the Soviet Union to remove missiles from Cuba. It shows Kennedy's intention to go to war with the Soviet Union if the missiles were not removed from Cuba. Again, this is your own understanding, your own conclusion after reading the entire source. What you will find is that these key ideas are not contained in the actual source. Okay, you have to come up with these to show that you are able to analyze the source. Okay, guys, I hope that helped you understand how to analyze your sources and how to answer questions and follow instructions. I will see you after the break. Over to you, Luni.
Thank you so much, Mamsi and Keta. I really do hope that this lesson is giving you all the preps that you need to help you study and help with your exams, guys. So we are going to take a break. Don't go anywhere. We'll see you straight after this.